Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mediation and Beyond YouTube. Thanks for coming. Today, I'm honored to have my friend and colleague, Attorney Deborah Noonan. Deb's been an attorney for 30 plus years and roughly 16 or so, 20 years in family law, 16 years in doing collaborative divorce and divorce mediations. And so I invited her on today to discuss what she does in her private practice, which is located in Norwalk, Connecticut. And I want her to discuss really some of the differences between mediation and collaborative divorce. Why would you choose either one? If you looked at my YouTube from yesterday, you would have seen my interview with Dr. Norman Klein about litigated divorces and why to kind of think twice about going down that lane. So there's obviously other options with divorce, and that's why I brought Deb on today, because I thought she would be a really valuable piece to helping people decide what to do when they're making that. It's a huge decision in your life, if you're going to get divorced or not. And it's not like you get a do-over. So it's not like mini golf where you get a mulligan, you get a do-over. It's, you get one chance to kind of get it right. And I always think knowledge is power. So Deb, thanks for coming on today. I really appreciate it. And so if you could start out with, well, let me just ask an initial question here. So I know you're married and you have quite a few children. Mm-hmm. And so why would somebody go to an attorney for divorce if that person has not been divorced? How can they add to a positive outcome for an equation that you're not personally familiar with? So then that lends it to this is your expertise. And so, and I'm also a little curious why family law. A lot of people will stay away from family law. It's like, I used to be a middle school teacher and people will say, middle school, I would never teach middle school. Sometimes you hear that about divorce attorneys. I would never do divorce. So yeah. Can you speak to a little bit what got you into this and sure. And what you think you bring to the table for it?
Sure. So, it's an interesting question. The fact that I am still married, never been through a divorce, how does that sort of either add and enhance my ability to be a good mediator, or how may that detract? And, I've never really given that question much thought, but I will say this, just because I'm married, and I do have a lot of children, I have 7, full disclosure, doesn't mean that my husband and I don't face the same challenges and issues that a divorcing couple goes through. We've just decided, for whatever reason, right, to remain married and work on our marriage in our own way. But it certainly has not insulated me from the issues that couples face all the time. So I don't think that just because I'm still married, that means that I don't understand the issues that a divorcing couple are going through. And I guess another way of answering is, you can go to a heart surgeon. Doesn't mean the heart surgeon had to have had heart problems and have had open heart surgery in order to perform at a high level as a heart surgeon. So
well, I like your answer. Actually, I think that's a really interesting thing, because most married people face the similar problems. It's whether or not you choose to be able to stay in that situation to handle it. And some people, for whatever reason, end up leaving, and some people end up staying and working through it the best they can. But that's actually a really obviously a very valid point, because everybody faces the same issues.
Right, exactly.
And so what led you then to get into family law of all things, so to speak?
So when I first started practicing, I was practicing sort of in general litigation. So as part of that practice, I did family law. And I really loved the fact that it was people oriented. It wasn't like when I was doing corporate or contract, they're just sort of these sterile numbers, or it was dealing with people. And I love working with people. And I come from a divorced family. So I was raised in a divorced family. And I can say that, and I love both of my parents and they were great parents, but I can tell you, and if they were still alive, I think they would admit that they did it in the worst possible way, that worst possible way.
Oh, gosh.
I have experienced what it's like to be in a dynamic where it's not healthy. So I am very motivated to help people go through a divorce in the healthiest, most mindful way possible. So I think that's what sort of drew me to initially to family law. And I have to say, I started out first doing litigation because that was sort of, and still is, unfortunately, the default for a lot of people. You know, you watch television, LA law, that's how you think, oh, you're getting a divorce, you have to get 2 attorneys and you have to sort of duke it out and hopefully you'll come to some kind of resolution, and if not, you'll go to trial. And even as an attorney, that is how I was educated in law school, and that is sort of what my understanding was of the process. So I started out doing that, but realized early on that I felt anyway, and this is a personal opinion, that I was actually contributing to the problem, that I was part of the problem and I wasn't actually being part of the resolution. So I started to actually do some research. This is many years ago, like over 20 years.
Can I ask, when you say you felt like you were part of the problem, what would you say, like, what were you feeling was your contribution?
So, I mean, when you are doing traditional divorce, and I want to sort of digress here for a minute. I don't want to give the impression that traditional divorce is always a bad model. Sometimes it has to be the way a divorce gets resolved. And we can talk later if you'd like why what those cases are. But there are definitely cases that are not suitable for mediation or for collaborative. And so the traditional model is important, and it's important that it's there. But the traditional model is an adversarial model. That is the system that we have in the United States for resolving disputes. It's an adversarial model. So it's one person versus the other. So as soon as you step into that arena, you are part of the adversarial dynamic. And in my opinion, that is not the right model to resolve family disputes.
Okay.
So it's like putting a square peg into a round hole. And right. I felt that by participating in that model, I was contributing to the continuation of this idea that that family disputes and should be resolved within that model. And I just don't believe that's true.
Okay. So, but I do appreciate what you said earlier on, that a traditional model of having each person having an attorney, there is a space for that, and it needs to be in place. So yeah, I agree with that, and I think that's a really good distinction for those people where it's needed. And again, that's a whole nother conversation, but it is a good space for people who have to choose to do that.
That's right.
And so then you went into doing research, then you must have started researching about mediation or collaborative.
Right. So mediation's been around longer than collaborative. So when I first started looking, collaborative was really in its infancy. So mediation was the thing that was sort of on the rise. So that is what I got trained, and I slowly started to transition my practice from litigation into mediation. And in a few short years, I was actually able to get rid of all my litigation cases and focus primarily and only on mediation. And then collaborative sort of came along. I did the training for collaborative. And so those two things make up my entire practice.
Can you speak to the differences? Like, what is for someone looking at this that may not know what mediation is, and then how does that differ from a collaborative divorce?
Sure. So both, I'll start out by talking about the similarities. They both are what we call ADR, alternative dispute resolution models. So both of them, the focus is, let's stay out of court. We're going to create an agreement with the help of the parties and their attorneys and mental health professionals and financial professionals. We're going to create an agreement where the clients are the architect of that agreement, and they stay out of court. The only time they go into court is at the very end in order to formalize their divorce. So that's their similarities. The differences are in mediation. Mediation occurs with one mediator who acts as a neutral, and they work with both parties to address the different issues. So there's asset division, a parenting plan, child support, alimony. That mediator works with both parties to help them address and resolve each of those issues. Personally, as a mediator, I oftentimes will bring in mental health professionals to come in and work with the parties on a parenting plan. Sometimes we'll bring in a divorce financial specialist who will come in and work with the parties on the financial issues. It depends upon the complexity of the case and the needs of each individual party. So I don't always do that, but I often do that. But ultimately, the parties arrive at a tentative final agreement. And at that point, I encourage them to go out and use what we call review counsel. So they do get their own attorneys to look over the agreement and give them their personal opinion, legal opinion about, do they think that the agreement is fair and equitable? And then they come back to mediation. If there's some changes that need to be made, we negotiate a little bit more, and they finally end up with a final agreement that they take into court and present to the judge and say, this is our divorce. Please grant us a divorce. So that's mediation. Collaborative, there is no mediator. Instead, each party has a collaboratively trained attorney. And that's very important because a lot of attorneys out there will say, oh, I settle all of my cases, I'm collaborative. That's not what a collaborative attorney is. There's a specific training. It's a complete paradigm shift in the way that they view the process. But each party has their own collaborative attorney. And all four, the two attorneys and the party, sign a collaborative divorce agreement that states many things, but the most important thing is it says that if at any point in time, one of the parties or an attorney feels that the collaborative process is broken down, they are free to leave it and go into another model, such as the traditional model, but they cannot take their collaborative attorney with them into that other model. And the reason why that's there, it's an incentive for both the parties and the attorneys to stick in the process, right? So we have an emotional meeting and tempers flare and people say, that's it, I'm done, I'm out of here, you're not being collaborative, come on, Deb, let's go file motions. My answer is gonna have to be, I'm sorry, I can't do that. You're gonna have to start new with somebody else. And sometimes that's enough of a, an inflection point for them to sit down and think, okay, wait a minute, maybe we need to stop this meeting for today, but I'm still committed to this process. So similar to mediation, the parties are the architect of their own agreement. The attorneys are there to give them guidance and to help them navigate, but ultimately it's their agreement. And that is the agreement that gets presented to the judge formalizes it and grants the divorce.
So in collaborative then, if they're having a hard time or someone wants to bail, they actually have to start all over from the beginning with another attorney.
They do. But let me also, I just want to go back to collaborative. Yeah. There's also a team model in collaborative, which I do almost exclusively, but not always. Because again, I take my clients as they sort of come in and I sort of assess what it is that they need. But oftentimes I'll do what's called a team approach in collaborative. What that means is in addition to the two attorneys, there is a divorce coach. He or she is not a therapist. I mean, they are a therapist by training, but they aren't acting as a therapist in the process. They're not dealing with your childhood, or it's really about divorce is emotional. The emotion oftentimes gets in the way. So the coach is there to help both parties navigate through that process in an emotionally healthy way. We also bring in a divorce financial specialist who helps the parties deal with the financial issues that they have to deal with. So we all work together as a team to get the parties to the end.
I like that. It's kind of like a holding space for people in a really, one of the most challenging times in their lives. And so you have a lot of people helping them out in different areas, which then in turn really helps the kids.
Exactly. And for me, the focus is always on the kids. Although I deal with a lot of, a lot of couples that don't have children or their children are grown, but nevertheless, I mean, the kids are, I try to always keep as the focus. I guess like a great metaphor that I love to use when I'm telling people what mediation and collaborative is as compared to traditional divorces. The sport of, oh gosh, with the ice thing, what's it called? I can't even think of it now. It's the sport with the.
Oh, were you on the ice? Were you rolling?
Yes.
It's almost almost like bocce on ice.
Yes, but I can't even think of it.
I can't think of it, but I know what you're talking about.
Okay, so in that, I always say that in a traditional model, the attorneys have their clients and they're kind of hauling them behind them through the process, right? Slugging through the mud and getting to the end. And I think mediation and collaborative is more like that sport that I can't think of.
Can't think of it either.
In that sport, what's important is the sweeper, right? So there's two people, right? There's the person who pushes the stone down the lane, and there's the person who's in front who sweeps the obstacles out of the way for the stone to make its path, right? And that's how I look at my job as a mediator and as a collaborative attorney, is I'm there to sweep the obstacles out of the way so that the clients, who are the stone in my metaphor,
right,
can make their way through the process obstacle-free. But at the end of the day, they're getting there on their own volition, right? It's their agreement, it's their process, and I'm there just to help them navigate and clean the obstacles out of the way for them.
Actually, I can't think of that name of that sport. I will after this ends, of course. But I like that analogy, like them gliding down and you're just kind of doing this for them so they can get to that land safely and get to where they need to get to.
Exactly.
What kind of people would not be a good fit for either mediation or a collaborative divorce?
So, I think almost everybody can do mediation or collaborative, but I would say in mediation, both parties have to feel safe and they have to feel as though they can self-advocate. Now, that doesn't mean that only people who are strong-headed and, can mediate, because a good mediator is going to make sure that the room stays balanced. And a good mediator will notice when one party isn't engaging and will help them engage, will reframe questions or answers in such a way as to give that person a voice. But there are some people that simply do not feel safe, either emotionally or physically. So if there's been domestic violence, especially recent domestic violence, I would not take that case as a mediated case. And if someone said to me, Deb, when I'm in that room, I simply I can't advocate for myself. I can't articulate what it is that I want or what my concerns or fears are, even though you're trying to help me do it, I simply can't do it. Then they're not a candidate for mediation, but they could probably do collaborative, where their advocate is in the room with them. So I think mediation would be domestic violence and people who simply don't feel like they can articulate what their needs are. And then if one of the parties, because it only takes one, has a very significant personality disorder, if somebody is, an extreme narcissist, if somebody is borderline, those people are extremely difficult to work with in a mediated setting. Not that they do any better, by the way, in the traditional model. They don't suddenly become, healthy people, but at least there's a judge there, sort of, the threat of the judge is sort of hanging over them as an anvil, and maybe it gets them to behave. But I don't know. I feel that anybody who's got that kind of mental health issue is not going to be easy to deal with in any model.
Right. No, it's going to be a problem no matter how you look at it.
Yeah.
In terms of COVID right now, has that altered the different frameworks of getting a divorce agreement done, at least in Connecticut, because we're in Connecticut, but you have mediation, collaboration, you have litigation. I would imagine a litigated is going to be tabled for a while, right? But to do something that's more streamlined, mediation or a collaborative would be a little easier right now, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I have to say, you know, in the early March when COVID first really hit, I think everybody's practice slowed down because everyone was focused on self-care and there was a lot of, you know, people were frightened. But after that sort of smoothed out, I have to say my practice is as robust as ever. And I think it's because people are realizing, hey, you know, we can get divorced and we don't need to go into court. We don't need to file motions. We don't need to wait for the court to open. I mean, the courts are closed right now. With the exception of emergency motions, they are slowly opening and they're doing things like remote hearings and remote status conferences, but it's still difficult to get in there. So the great thing about mediation and collaborative is I'm doing most of mine on Zoom. We get it done. And the court just recently, about 4 weeks ago, started to do something that we people who practice in mediation have been asking them to do for decades, is they're now allowing people to get divorced what's called on the papers, meaning you no longer have to physically appear in court and say, here's my agreement, please divorce me. You can now submit all of your paperwork and a judge will review it, and then you'll get an email from the court saying your divorce has been granted. So
Nice.
yeah, so we're hoping that that is going to remain post-COVID, this ability to get divorced on the papers. We're hoping that that's going to survive.
Now, where does family services play in to that? Because you used to have to go to family services a lot if you had children. Are they out of the picture? Are they assuming that if you've mediated or it was collaborative, then that's all been taken care of and the parties are in agreement?
So you never had to go to family relations if you did mediation or collaborative because you were outside of the process. They didn't even know you existed, right? You got your whole case done, you filed your paperwork, you went in and you got divorced. Family relations is really there. And for those who don't know what family relations is an arm of the court. It's usually made up of the family relations officers are typically therapists, sometimes they're attorneys. And what happens is if you go into court or on a motion, the judge says, I don't want to hear your complaints yet. I want you to go to family relations and see if you can work it out with them first. And if you can't, then you come back and we'll have your hearing. So family relations never played into mediation or collaborative. However, now they're having family relations officers review some agreements before they're getting handed to judges. That's the only thing. Yeah.
And that, I imagine, making sure that the children are taken care of, like that part of things?
Yes, yes. Although we're hoping in the next couple of weeks to have that change so that even mediated agreements are going straight to the judges instead of sort of having to stop first at family relations. Just one unusual step.
And with regard to, you've been an attorney for a lot of years. You've seen a lot of things. No two marriages, no two divorces are ever the same. That's what I think is, it's fascinating work, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think that the most common issues are that people get stuck? Is it in the parenting agreements? I mean, that's what I see a lot of, but is it in that, or do you think it's more in the asset part? Or
I personally think it's more asset and alimony. Alimony is a hot button issue for both parties. The person that needs it, my experience is they don't want it, but they feel like they need it for a variety of reasons. Someone's been a stay-at-home parent for 20 years, has been out of the workforce, has no marketable skills quite yet, needs a runway to get sort of up on his or her feet. So there's a plethora of reasons why people need alimony, but I find very few people who can't wait to get it. Most people say, if I could, I'd walk away and I'd ask him or her to help support me, but I need to. And the person who has to pay it feels very resentful that, they're no longer in a relationship with this person, yet they have to support them. So, I see it on both sides. And so that tends to be the issue that I find is the hardest. It's not that it's the hardest, it's the most prevalent that I see. I think the hardest issue, when there is an issue, is children, right? Yeah. Because they're your kids. So, but thankfully, and I don't know if it's just because people who choose mediation and collaborative are sort of self-selecting, and they're people who already tend to be a little bit more rational about things. I don't know, but I don't come across a lot of parenting issues. But when I do, they're difficult for the very reason this isn't money, this isn't an asset, this is your kid. So when there are parenting issues, they tend to be pretty significant.
But if they're in mediation or collaboration, even though they can be intense and significant, the chances of working that out rather than going down that litigated road is far better, right? And that's when you said you bring in, you have the divorce coach, right? So you
I'll
have
give
that.
you a brief anecdote. So I was working with a couple once, and parenting was their big issue. And we spent many, many hours, more hours than I typically spend on a parenting plan, getting them to a good place. Neither one of them were thrilled, but I always say it's a sign of a good agreement when you're both mutually dissatisfied. But the kids were taken care of under this parenting plan. But anyway, they decided to finish the case up with an attorney. And I kind of felt there was something funny there, but whatever. I left, they moved in with using attorneys. Within a week, I found out that they have a guardian ad litem appointed. So if there's a guardian ad litem appointed in a case, right away, that's a red flag that the court anyway considers that a high conflict matter. So they went from having a complete parenting plan that, like I said, they neither were 100% happy with it, but it was a good plan. They went from that to that plan getting completely blown up, and now they've got a guardian ad litem involved. So they've got a long road ahead of them in the litigation system.
I would imagine though that's less often that happens, because when people leave a mediation or a collaborative, I imagine that's it. We've agreed. Let's move on. So something obviously something went askew in that one.
Yeah. Yes. Because very few. I have to say, and again, I'm not touting my own horn here. I think that, like I said, I think people who choose mediation and collaborative are self-selecting, so they're going to get through the process. But I have to say, I lose very, very, very few cases fall out of mediation and go to traditional divorce. And yes, I'd like to think part of that is because I'm good at what I do, but I think more than that, I think those people are committed to wanting to get through this process. So they're going to.
Do you see for divorce itself, with attorneys, like the attorneys' mindsets shifting to, like when you were coming out of law school or starting out years ago, it was kind of like that's how it was set up, is that adversarial position for divorce. Do you see that the culture, because that's big for me, like the culture of divorce, I'd like to see become kinder, and that's where I think mediation comes in, and obviously the mindset of attorneys, the way they're trained, like that all has to start shifting too. Do you see that among your colleagues? More of a shift?
I do, and to give them sort of their props, even litigation attorneys, 99.9% of them are settlement oriented and do care about the family and do care about their client. But as I said, they're working in a system that is set up to be adversarial. Mm-hmm. So you almost can't help yourself. If you're going to work within that system, there are certain things, there's certain behaviors, there are certain things that you need to do in order to do it well within that system. So I don't blame the attorneys, I blame the system. I think the system needs to change. I really don't think divorce should actually be in the legal realm, other than you should go in there to finalize your agreement. But I think all of the negotiating and all of the working should really happen outside of that process, because it's not suited to address the concerns that come up in a divorce.
Right, like family court almost seems like an oxymoron, like it doesn't need the two, right? The two words don't even go together. But I also, in defense of attorneys who do litigate, right? I mean, they're working for somebody. They're driven by the client too. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, and if someone recommends, well, this is probably as good as it's going to get. You're not going to get that much further in a courtroom. If someone wants to push it, they're hired to push it.
That's right. That's right. And unless someone really just feels like the client is asking them to do something that borders on being unethical,
right,
they're going to do it. That's their job. They were hired to do it. They're going to do their job. But so exactly. So that's why, you know, I've got a lot of friends and colleagues who do traditional divorce, and they're great people and they're great professionals and they do a great job. But I just don't want to work in that model and that framework anymore.
Do you see the system being more open to change? Because you're saying it's more systemic.
I absolutely do. I think that in an odd way, COVID has sort of pushed the Connecticut judicial system into the 21st century. You know, the idea that you can get divorced without going in and, you know, being canvassed by the judge. And there's just a lot of, yes, I think ADR, alternative dispute resolution, I'm hoping before I retire will become the norm, and going to trial will be the, you know, what happens when all else fails, as opposed to sort of the other way around.
And it still is a small percentage of people who actually do go to trial. Isn't it like 5 or 7%?
No, it's under 2%. So
okay.
Yeah. So that's what I tell people all the time is, just because you get into that traditional model doesn't mean your case will ever be heard by a judge, because 98% of litigated cases end up settling. So the question I say to my clients is, you have a decision to make. What trajectory, what path do you want to take to that settlement? Do you want to take a mediation or collaborative path and get to that settlement? Or do you want to go in the traditional model with all of the things that you have to do in that model and ultimately settle? So which path do you want to take? Because less than 2% of those people are ever going to get their day in court. And when they do, I think a lot of it, and this is where therapists come in, I think a lot of it is the psychological. They want to be redeemed, or they want to be validated, and they think the judge is going to stand up in his or her black robe and turn to the other party and say, you caused the breakdown of the marriage, and he or she was this perfect husband or wife, and you're going to get all the money. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work like that. And people get sadly disappointed when they have that day in court and it's not what they thought it was going to be. And
well, there's an inherent expectation, and it's usually unmet.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. So I try to help people not get to that place. I want them to stay out of that.
Yeah, well, and have a more realistic expectation of what their outcome is probably going to be anyways, which I think you have to take away I always say emotion is not a place to start from. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, if you're in your emotion, whether it's anger, hurt, frustration, whatever it is, that doesn't really have space in good decision making. So if you can work with somebody else on those things, I mean, the feelings are valid. I'm not denying the feeling. But when you're trying to have a bigger picture and plan your life out and your family's life and how that's how that's changing, those feelings need to be put over there and worked out in a different arena.
Right. That's why we need people like you, Colleen.
Yeah, there you go.
No, in all seriousness, because you are the person that helps that person, the client, self-regulate and understand that, yes, emotions are real and they're valid and you're entitled to have them, but you can't let them drive or blind you during this process, because ultimately you're not going to end up with a good result.
No.
You know, I mean, I've had clients who want the marital home. They want the marital home for whatever reason, and it's laden with all these emotional, and I get it. I would hate to have to move out of my house. So I understand it. And they push, and that's what they want. And they're so single focused. And then they realize, well, I can't afford it. I mean, all of a sudden the reality sets in, and hopefully it sets in before they've signed an agreement. But sometimes people push, and then when it's all said and done, they're 6 months down the road, they think, what did I do? I could tell you what you did. You let your emotions get in the way of being practical and rational. So that's why it's so important to have mental health professionals involved, whether it's, you know, one-on-one in the mediation room or the parties are working off to the side with somebody, but just to get them to self-regulate is so important.
Well, the name of my practice is Mediation and Beyond, and it's more about the beyond part, because after the mediation or divorce or litigation, whatever you choose is done, the choices you made in that, you have to live that out now. Now you have to live with it. And I see a lot of people coming back like, I didn't do a good job in my parenting, or I kept the house, like you're saying, and I can't afford it, or I kept the kids in private school, but I said I'd pay, and now it turns out that wasn't a good idea. And I think people forget about the beyond part, because it is an agreement that you have to live with, and how that plays out is so important.
I agree. And I tell people in mediation, the traditional model is more backwards looking. Now, what happened in the past to justify why you should get or not get this today. And in mediation, I tell people, and in collaborative, the focus is forward thinking, right? It doesn't matter how you got here, you're here. How do you want to move forward in your life where you both can be healthy and happy and financially secure, as secure as you can be given the resources that you have? And what do you want your life to look like going forward? And what can we do now to set the stage for that going forward? So that's
that's really perfect. I talk to people about like looking in the rear view as opposed to looking in the windshield. You know, which mirror lens is bigger, and you really do want to keep looking forward. And I agree with you so much that, you know, mediation and collaboration provide those opportunities for that. So, and just lastly, I'll just ask this because I think it's really important. The benefit, I always worry about the kids, and we touched on that a little earlier, but the benefits of mediation or collaborative versus going to trial with a judge or going down the arguing lane. What do you see as the benefit for the children from your lens, from what you do?
So, I mean, there's so many answers to that question. So just from a practical perspective, think of the money you're spending in litigation on the attorneys and the experts and going to trial going in for mini hearings along the way. The amount of money that people spend in litigation could most likely fund their kids' college education or their hockey camp. So just from a very practical, perspective, you're taking money away from your kids when you go down that path. The other thing is, kids know when things aren't well between mom and dad. I don't care how well people think they hide it. They say, oh, we don't fight in front of the kids. Kids know. So when they see the people that they love most in the world not getting along and attacking one another, they are what I call, they inhale that. And they are the collateral damage. So, and then if you're fighting about custody, there's a guardian ad litem appointed, and the guardian ad litem has to meet with the children. And sometimes there's psychological exams that get done and family studies that get done. So the kids have all of these different professionals in their lives. It's just not a good process for them. It's just not a good process for them. They need to see their parents. I always say you need to have at least a business relationship with one another, right? When you see somebody, if you're working, you stick your hand out, you say, hey, how are you? Nice to see you. You don't swear at them and yell at them and tell them that they're schmuck, right? I mean, that's at a minimum, you have to be able to
or the silent treatment, right? Or the silent treatment's another one.
And I always say to people, how do you sit in court and eviscerate each other? And then leave that day and have a conversation about who's picking Johnny up from soccer or who's picking Mary up from, how do you do that, right? I mean, the way you behave now in your divorce affects greatly how you're going to behave with each other post-divorce after all the dust has settled. So start out good now, and it's only up from there. So I just, it's the best thing for kids.
So so really what it is, it's modeling relationships for your children. And when you don't get along, you don't take all your toys out of the sandbox and go home, and right. So you got to play nice.
Yeah. And
right?
parents don't think, and this is not a criticism of the parents, because we all do this, it's human nature. When you're going through a crisis, you become very self-focused and you're not really paying attention to what's going on around you. So I can't tell you how many parents have told me, because I also do guardian ad litem work, who have told me that, oh no, they know their children aren't picking up on this, or they're doing this for their best interest of their kids. And meanwhile, their kids are falling apart. And I don't think that they really understand what you just articulated so well, which is they are looking to you to see how to model your behavior. And I always say, when kids are little and they fall, when they're learning how to walk, when they fall, if you say, oh, are you okay? They burst into tears, right? Because they're mirroring what they see in you. If they trip and you just sort of act like you didn't see them, they get up, they dust themselves, those little legs off, and off they go. And it's the same thing in divorce. They look to you to see, how are you handling this?
That's a great way to put that, Deb, because we model everything, and they're little sponges, and they will absorb wherever we're at. So if mommy's upset, they're going to have loyalty to mommy, right? And they don't want to do anything to upset, so maybe they won't go with dad because it upsets mommy, or vice versa. I'm not certainly picking on one or the other, but they really do get put in the middle. And I think with mediation and collaborative divorce like you do, it really sets up the family, because you're always a family. The parents divorce, they're not divorcing the children, right? Mom's not divorcing the children, and dad's not divorcing. The parents' marriage is changing, but they're always a family. There's only one mommy, one daddy. And how they play that out will forever be how the children end up with relationships, and how well they do in the future. So the legacy is so important.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So
I tell
mediation,
clients I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I tell clients that they're writing their children's history as they speak, right? And you can't erase that history once it's written. It's there. So be careful what you're writing for them, because it doesn't.
That's like saying at the beginning, you don't get a do-over on it.
Right. Right.
Well, great. Thank you so much for this. This is I think just a great conversation. I think hopefully the goal of it for me, and I know for you too, speaking for you, is to really help people be able to make quality decisions surrounding their situation. Every situation's different. Like we said early on, sometimes you need to have each your own attorney and work it out that way, but know that there's other models out there, such as collaborative, where you can have your own attorney still, but more of a team approach. And then there's mediation, where you just have the neutral. So Deb, if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Probably my email, which is my name, last name followed by my first. So it's Noonan, Noonan, Deborah, Deborah, at M as in Mary, S as in Sam, N as in Nancy, MSN.com. Can you tell I say that a lot?
Well, thank you so much. I know you're swamped and you're busy, and I really appreciate you coming on. And I think I have you on in the future, and we can have more of a discussion around guardian ad litems and that kind of work for families. So we'll talk again. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. All right.
I appreciate you having me on, and I'm going to look up the name of that ice sport.
I was going to do it too after we got off. All right. Thanks, Deb. Take care. All right. Bye-bye.